something is true or not, you set up an experiment to see whether under certain conditions then A leads to B. And this is also the way pragmatists considered approaching, let's say, epistemology and more philosophical problems. This also included a rejection of these a priori models of historical development, right? These teleological models of history, as we saw, which pragmatists considered an old European understanding of history, and they also went for a much more evolutionary understanding history simply as a trial and error model and not as a directed process of any kind. Pragmatists were also a political movement, and they stood in favor of individualism in general. So also opposing the more holist approaches on the European side. In a way, they followed a Tocquevillian understanding of local democracy, bottom-up associationism, they wrote against this backdrop of rising inequalities. Think about the 1880s, 90s in the United States, which was both a period of economic growth, obviously, but also of many social tensions with strike movements, also violence happening. Pragmatists' response then was to strengthen these local institutions. We will re-encounter pragmatists and their influence also in the following lectures. So they were not only important for Webb Du Bois, to whom we turn now, but they also influenced the Chicago School. So this urban sociology school associated with Mead, Isaac Thomas, Robert Park. They were also still important in, let's say, sort of the New Deal kind of sociology, lost importance then in the post-Second World War sociology, and there was a certain renaissance of pragmatist ideas then ever since the 1970s with, actually mostly philosophers here, Rorty Brennan in the United States, who revived pragmatist ideas, Habermas here on the European continent, and 20 years ago, in this very lecture, Hans Joas is probably the sociologist in Germany most renowned for using pragmatism also in sociology. But let's turn then to Webb Du Bois as probably the unwritten founder of American sociology. When you open textbooks about the history of American sociology, it often starts with the Chicago School that I just mentioned, that was built ever since the 1890s at the Chicago University, had its first generation of authors then in the early 1900s and a second generation in the interwar years. But this, let's say, history ignores a little bit the fact that even before the major publications of this Chicago school, there was something like, if you want, an Atlanta school that Webb Du Bois, the African-American founder of sociology, had already covered. So that is why I follow some of these thinkers here, which I cite in the following, in considering Webb Du Bois rather as the often unmentioned founder of American sociology. So Du Bois lived almost a century and is really a colorful figure, an enormous intellectual kind of figure. If you have some spare time over the Christmas period, for instance, I can really recommend also reading this biography of his. So he was born then in Massachusetts and attended a black college at a black college in Fisk, Fisk College in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, and then studied in Berlin actually at the German Historical School. Was at the time, this was the Friedrich Wilhelm University, now the Humboldt University. He was denied a PhD, which he then did at Harvard University, and he did this in history. Yeah. You might wonder where the name Du Bois comes from. French sounding, right? Means basically from the wood in France. So this is due to the fact that his father's line immigrated to the United States from Haiti, so formerly a French colony, at the Berlin University, he studied with the very same figures in the German intellectual landscape that also Max Weber studied with, so Gustav Schmoller. And this is also much of what inspired his, let's say, general historical approach to sociology as well. So yeah, he also studied with William James, the founder of pragmatism. In his dissertation, he showed that the US had actually historically supported and benefited from slave trade, and this even after its formal abolition, at least in the English-speaking world in 1808. And this was at the time a very controversial thesis, because the United States had often been seen as the country that had also fought for an abolition of international slave trade, that was not necessarily involved in it, and that it happened particularly also after the abolition, 1808, was very new for the time period. The most, let's say, sociological classical work of his is the book The Philadelphia Negro, that was published in 1899. So the notion Negro was in current use at the time, referred to the Black or African American population. In the 1950s, 60s, the term became more and more offensive and is nowadays obviously not used in scholarly publications anymore. So this just as a footnote about why the title is what it is then. And the book is, if you want, a founding document of urban sociology avant la lettre, so before it even was coined as a discipline at the Chicago School. And you could say that in the 1890s, then in the early 1900s, there was something like an Atlanta school that Du Bois founded. So he had PhD students who worked similarly like him on basically the problem of race in American society through the lens of urban sociology. Du Bois is such a colorful figure because, if you want, his academic decade then ended also in the early 1900s, and he turned away from academic and purely scholarly work and engaged practically in changing the race problem in the United States first, and in the, let's say, second half of his life then internationally. So he founded a journal, the Crisis, a newspaper, then in the 1900s, and was more of a journal editor and a public figure. And he wrote, let's say, less scholarly books of equal importance. The Souls of Black Folk here, which introduces the notion of a double consciousness that I will turn to in a second. And he was also co-founder then of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored people in 1909. He is also often attributed to be in favor of, let's say, a more elitist understanding of how the African American movement should be organized. This is contested, but for those who understand Du Bois as an elitist, that is a small elite, so the talented 10th, should promote the fight for civil and political rights of African Americans, then Du Bois also has writings that support this idea. In the first part of his life, so up to World War I, Du Bois wrote largely against another African American reformer of his time, Booker T. Washington, who had built up a huge, if you want, political machine in favor of, let's say, solving the race problem in a more conservative way, often referred to as the Atlanta Compromise, which, was too accommodating for the younger generation of Webb Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington had the idea that sort of vocational training, also top-down kind of reforms in favor of economically uplifting the African Americans should be the key strategy. And in this kind of accommodating kind of strategy, he was very successful. He was received also by various presidents and had built up a huge political machine of support among the African American population. And young scholars such as Webb Du Bois openly attacked him then ever since the 1900s for the much too conservative approach. And eventually also this younger generation then took over. There's a certain rupture then again after the Second World War, First World War in Webb Du Bois' life. He was a pacifist during the war, similar to Jane Addams, another founder of American Sociologist. And being a pacifist towards the end of the war was not a very popular position. And this shifted also Webb Du Bois' general interest from, let's say, the national race problem to the more international problem, post-colonial problem, and raised also his first interest in socialism. And you can already figure that this then eventually turned to problems, particularly in the post-Second World War period, when, let's say, acquaintance with sort of socialist leaders and ideas became even a problem for the FBI, and his strong, let's say, anti-war, pro-peace and anti-imperialist stances became more and more suspicious at home, such that he had even to emigrate and also died in exile then in Ghana, whose liberation movement Du Bois had actively supported as well. In his later life, among the most important work is then this Encyclopedia Africana, published, a huge work also about the problem of